Welcome back to another episode of Mormon Traditionalist Podcast. My name is Jaron O'Driscoll, and I am your host. And I'm so glad to be back out here in the studio talking to you folks again. Getting out here is one of the highlights of my week. And today we have another guest interview. Over the next 2 weeks, we will be hearing from Steve Smoot with the Family First Foundation. Steve has been on my radar for a long time now. I've wanted to get him in front of the mic for a while now, and it all finally came together not once, but twice. I actually interviewed him once and had a malfunction with my recording equipment and didn't notice until it was all said and done that my device didn't save the recording. But that just meant that I got to sit down with Steve again and talk, and I feel like I can call him a good friend now. Steve has done a lot of amazing research on multiple topics, which he will reference in our interview. But here we will be talking about what is known as the Wanton destruction. Now, we've talked before about 3 things that Satan actively attacks to discredit evidence for the gospel: the Restoration, the founding of the United States and the Constitution, and science. And there's one key element that is crucial to understanding all those topics, and that is the Scriptures. And in this case specifically, the Book of Mormon. You see, the Book of Mormon corroborates how God established both the restoration of the gospel and the founding of the United States. The Doctrine and Covenants does this too, and obviously Satan has been attacking the restoration to discredit those scriptures. But the Book of Mormon is what Satan wants to discredit the most, I think. That book is the keystone of our religion, and Satan knew at the moment that Mormon began compiling it. And he knew he had to discredit it. Steve is going to break down how Satan worked to do that. The evidence for the Nephite and Jaredite civilizations is irrefutable, both from the scriptures and the words of modern-day prophets and early church leaders, and is reflected in the Hopewell and Adena cultures of North America, the Hopewell being the Nephites and the Adena being the Jaredites. We'll have Rod Meldrum on in the future to make that case. But for today, the active destruction, hiding, and later on ignoring of these cultures is what we will be going over. We decided that it would be best to let Steve take the reins and tell us all about this in detail. This subject has so many moving parts and it is so fascinating. Pay attention to who the players are in this and who was influencing who. Let's get into it. Buckle up. All right, everybody, we've got Steve Smoot with us today. Steve, how are you doing?
Great. It's good to be with you.
Right, yeah, we're glad to have you here. So today we're talking about what is known as the Wanton destruction. What is it you're planning on sharing with us today?
Well, today I want to share you some insights into my book, Lost America's Antiquities, A Hidden History, and insights into our documentary, The Lost Civilizations of North America, as both of them are critical reviews on how history has been handed down to our day. I will also be sharing you insights into the cancel culture movement of the 1800s and how evolutionary and revolutionary and revelatory ideas being advanced in the 1800s has truly altered the course of human history. Answering some of the why, how, and the who questions. That if there are advanced civilizations here in North America, why don't we know more about them? Why haven't they been more celebrated? And if the knowledge of these civilizations have been silenced, who silenced them and why? And how did that all come about? It has been said that history is to a nation what memory is to man, and that no one has really influenced the future of society any more than historians, as history provides that foundational underpinnings that's needed for the character building of a people and a nation. Today, where do we find in America's history textbooks the ancient history of the mound-building cultures, the ancestry of the American Indian? I mean, do you read about the Hopewell, the Adena, and the Mississippian cultures? I mean, is that found in your college or high school textbooks? Did these early men in science and government look to erase America's ancient history as part of their manifest destiny agenda to really gather up the Indians and place them on reservations? So was there a cancel culture movement at work in the 1800s? And do we find some of the same social engineering tactics being implemented and replicated today? In the production of our documentary, The Lost Civilizations of North America, we set out to interview the foremost scholars that we could find who had studied these ancient mound building cultures and ancient history. And in so doing, an understanding of this daunting history emerged as we came to realize that this is a larger history than just the loss of America's antiquities, which is huge, or even the exploration of the geography of the Book of Mormon in North America. It is a story of how and why the recovery of this knowledge has been hampered, hidden, and manipulated, and how the provocations were motivated by a myriad of issues facing these early men of science and government in the 1800s, and how it has had a huge effect on not only the American Indians, but many other norms, that we see today, and really how this history has been handed down to us. The suppression of this ancient history, and as we have looked at the past, has really been part of the human story for centuries. History has witnessed that every great culture and civilization of ancient times, from the Greeks to the Romans to the Egyptians to the Phoenicians, they all had statues and monuments that were defaced, torn down, and destroyed. As conquering armies made it their mission to erase their history. Now, did the American Indians see this happen to their ancient history? In the 1800s, with this manifest destiny agenda that was taking place, did similar efforts take place with the ancient history of North America? Now, we were blessed to be able to interview no less an authority than Dr. Roger Kennedy, former director of the Smithsonian American History Museum, just prior to his passing in 2011, where he gave us some incredible insights into these more highly advanced cultures than we have been led to believe. In Dr. Kennedy's book that he published after he retired from the Smithsonian, that he published in 1994, Dr. Kennedy stated that few realize that some of the most complex structures of ancient archaeology were built in North America, home of some of the most highly advanced and well-organized civilizations in the world. After he heard that we were going to name our documentary, The Lost Civilizations of North America, Dr. Kennedy says, no. You need to change the name of your documentary because it wasn't a lost history. It was a hidden history. Even though thousands of these earthwork structures and mounds have been destroyed, today you can still go out there and visit some incredible sites. In 2017, I visited the Okemukee Mound site in Macon, Georgia, where there still remains three very impressive mounds. One is a giant platform mound, approximately 3 stories high. Another is a burial mound, and the third mound has an inner chamber inside of it. After visiting these archaeological sites, it really begs the question as to why more Americans don't know more about these mound building cultures. One site that we visited was the Miamisburg Mound site in Ross County, Ohio, which gives evidence of this more highly advanced culture. Many of the early settlers and explorers believed in a lost race because they didn't really believe that the American Indians, as viewed as a savage culture, would be capable of this sustained effort as needed to quarry tons of earth. The Miamisburg Mound, for example, is 68 feet high, 852 feet in circumference. It contains over 311 cubic feet of soil, which that would consist of about 20,000 wagon loads of dirt. And that wasn't all. There was over 500 mounds and 100 giant earthworks found in Ross County, Ohio alone. In addition to the mounds, there is what they call the Hopewell Road, located in Ohio, which was a 60-mile long road made up of a cement like material. The date that was given for this as they studied this site at the Miamisburg Mound site, right on the front plaque sign out front, states from 1000 BC to 400 AD, which is a very interesting correlation with the Book of Mormon timeline. Now, recently, I traveled with my son to Moundville, Alabama, which boasts some of the largest ancient mound sites found here in North America. At this site, there are 9 giant iconic mound structures. At the peak of the Mississippian culture, there were over 29 platform and burial mounds, with an estimated population of over 30,000 residents. Now, found at this site were stunning artifacts, metal tools and weapons, refined copper ornaments, sister gardens, and native medicines. For the past 31 years in October, the Indian tribes gathered for what they call the Parade of Fire in celebration of their ancient ancestry. They paraded around these sacred mounds, and they climb atop these giant platform mounds. At Moundville, Alabama National Park, while we were there, I met with Michael, Choctaw Indian, a park administrator and who also had oversight over an Indian youth tribal group. We discussed how important history is for the development of the Indian nations and how the Indian population's ancient history has been referred to as prehistory, as if there's no written record of their people's existence, which loss of their ancient history resulted in the loss of really their identity, as the world has really little appreciation and understanding of the richness of the American Indian cultures. In 1814, the United States government under Andrew Jackson waged a battle against the Creek Indians called the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. This battle was a devastating defeat for the Creek Indians of that area, a battle that led to the passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which led to the expulsion of the primary tribes found in the Alabama Territory, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasha, and the Creek Indian tribes. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 brought about a historical march, the Trail of Tears, as the Indian populations were being expelled from their native lands. That was the very same year that the Book of Mormon came off the press, and the very same year that Joseph Smith called and sent missionaries to the Indians, as referred to in the 28th and 32nd section of the Doctrine and Covenants as Oliver's mission to the Lamanites. So Joseph Smith viewed the mission that he was sending some of his most loyalist followers to the Lamanites. Now, one of the best records that we have of these mound building cultures is a book of surveys that became the very first publication of the Smithsonian, The Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, where E.G. Squires and Davis had surveyed hundreds of these mounds, fortifications, and earthwork structures, and even gathered about 6,000 artifacts from these sites. One question raised in the early 1800s was really what to call these mound building cultures. And the name was given was Adena and Hopewell cultures, as they were named after the landowners on whose farm some of the earliest mound explorations had taken place, with the Hopewell being named after Captain Mordecai C. Hopewell. The Hopewell is viewed as the largest of these mound building cultures. So, how many remember reading about these ancient cultures of the Hopewell and Adena and the Mississippian cultures? To gain an understanding into this larger history and into the silence surrounding these mound building cultures, one must come to understand the influence that these three men had on this early American history. These early men of science and government, E.G. Squires, Lewis Henry Morgan, and John Wesley Powell, they came to realize that they could address many social and political issues facing society in the 1800s, and how their views into the origin and evolution of man and the origin of the ancient mound building cultures have been used to really alter the course of human history. Now, E.G. Squires, who authored the first publication of the Smithsonian, upon its publication, which was really referred to at the time as a monumental work, after they'd studied it a while, these men of science started to push back, realizing that some of the findings that he was bringing forth was really going contrary to the government's manifest destiny, really seeing the Indians as a savage culture. And if they would be viewed as a more highly advanced culture, maybe you'd have to give them rights under a constitutional law. Lewis Henry Morgan, who is the American father of anthropology, a man that introduced social Darwinism to the American culture, was very influential in the sciences. And so we are going to talk a little bit about what he has brought forth. Also, John Wesley Powell, the American father of conservation, a man who became probably the most powerful man in the sciences in the 1800s. These early men would have a huge influence on the artifacts that were being found and how they'd be classified. These men actually came together in the mid-1800s in Buffalo, New York, to form a subset of the Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Advancement of Science, where both Morgan and Powell would later become president of that organization. Now, E.G. Squires was a prolific writer. After turning over his first two books to the Smithsonian for publication, he really complained about their heavy-handed editing that was taking place on his books. And so he decided to publish a third book entitled The Antiquities of the State of New York on his own in Buffalo, New York, where he shared this observation. There is almost positive evidence that the mound builders were an agricultural people, considerably advanced in the arts, possessing great uniformity throughout the whole territory, which they occupied in manners, habits, and religion. A uniformity sufficiently marked to identify them as a single people, having a common origin, common modes of life, and as a consequence, common sympathies, if not a common and consolidated government. The battle of opinions, however, would begin to ensue as they would escalate, even making personal attacks against Squire's work, as it was really going against their manifest destiny agenda. And it started to take a toll on the health of E.G. Squires, evidently because he was committed to an insane asylum for the last 14 years of his life. Now, E.G. Squires, in his 1851 book, The Antiquities of the State of New York, he shared this quote from the history of the Holland Purchase. The bone pits, which occur on some parts of western New York, Canada, and Michigan, etc., have unquestionably a corresponding origin. They are of various sizes, but usually contain a large number of skeletons. One of these pits, discovered some years ago in the town of Cambia, Niagara County, was estimated to contain the bones of several thousand individuals. This locality was visited by Mr. O. Turner of Buffalo, New York in 1823. Now, 1823 is a significant date, for it was that very same year that the doctrine of discovery debate was being waged before the U.S. Supreme Court. The case was Johnson versus McIntosh, which they ruled that the Indians only had the rights to occupancy of the land and not ownership of land. The reason given was that the Indians had not evolved to the state of a full human. This early ruling would really change how we have come to view and value the American Indians and these mound building cultures, changing how America's ancient history has been handed down to our day. Now, John Wesley Powell's biographer, Wallace Stegner, stated that the man that in fact understood it was a one-armed little man with a bristly beard, a homemade education, and an intense concentration of purpose. When he assumed the joint dictatorship of two bureaus which he had created in Washington, Powell controlled a good part of the science of man and the science of the earth. And he conceived both in the broadest possible terms. It just so happens that John Wesley's father, Joseph Powell, was a circuit minister in Palmyra, New York, when the Book of Mormon came off the press in 1830. Now, Powell's life was very much a shadow of the migration of the saints westward. He moved from New York to Illinois, kind of following the trail of the saints, and was placed over Indian affairs over the Utah and Idaho region. Now, Powell, after moving from New York to Illinois, he was hired by the Indian Affairs to travel west to the Four Corners area, looking for reservation sites for the placement of the Indians. And that's what took him down to the Colorado River Basin, in which he ran the Colorado River. But before running the mighty Colorado, Powell was advised to talk to Jacob Hamlin, a political and religious leader in St. George, in an effort to find ways to really assure the safety of his party. Because previously, Indian scrimmages had taken place there in that area. And they wanted, safe passage through. But as they were going down the river, they came to what was called Separation Rapids. Part of Powell's party, William Dunn and the two Howland brothers, decided not to go any further because they didn't know what was ahead at the river, which consists of about 13 miles of some of the most fierce rapids found in America. Only later, they were found, though, as they wandered off looking for their trail back to the St. George area, only to be found dead, with evidence pointing of an Indian attack, which point really affected Powell, as Powell became very antagonistic towards the Indians and even the Mormon settlers. After running the mighty Colorado, John Wesley Powell became, as he went back to Washington, became a national folk hero, as his stories and encounters with the Indians and the Mormons became legendary, returning to the East to find his professional home in Washington, D.C., where he became director over the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian, and director over the U.S. Geological Survey Department, and director over Mound-Building exploration. In these positions, he would have a profound influence on how these ancient artifacts were being classified. And as director of the U.S. Geological Survey Department, Powell would use his influence in stopping Western settlements taking place, something that he had witnessed had taken place with the Mormons with their migration westward. The reason why we have about 61% of the state of Utah is owned by the federal government can be traced and credited back to John Wesley Powell. Now, John Wesley Powell would state in his book, Seeing Things Whole, which he co-authored with William DeBise, he said, "Whether we desire it or not, the ancient inhabitants of this country must be lost. And we may comfort ourselves in the reflection that they are not destroyed, but are gradually absorbed to become part of a more civilized communities." He also stated that social problems are so complex that few are willing and able to comprehend all the factors. And so the people are divided into two great parties, one crying for the blood, demanding the destruction of the Indians, the others begging that they may be left in their aboriginal condition and that the progress of civilization may be stayed. Kind of giving you an insight in how he viewed the Indians. Another of Powell's biographers, Donald Worcester, gives us this insight. Powell's life is also a story of the rising influence of the natural sciences, of rationalism contesting the faith of traditional religion, and of a new nationalism and secularism taking its place. As he was coming of age, science was rising to influence the study of nature and culture and even the making of laws. In his day, science meant, above all, geology, evolution, and Darwinism. The contest of those ideas with what is now called religious fundamentalism for the supremacy of the American mind is mirrored in Powell as nowhere else. This was at a time when the science was rising to influence what? The study of nature. Really questioning whether God had a hand involved in the organization found in nature. Introducing evolutionary ideas that would actually revolutionize society. For what purpose? As he stated, to gain supremacy over the American mind and for the indoctrination of a rising generation. Now, Powell so believed that he was seeing things whole that he had his brain removed at his death and weighed because he really believed that it had grown to a much larger extent than the average man. Now, Lewis Henry Morgan, who was a mentor to John Wesley Powell, he was born in Aurora, New York in 1818. After graduating from Union College, New York, law school in 1840, in 1844 to 1881, he moved and lived in Rochester, New York, where he became a well-known attorney and a politician, a very successful businessman, making a small fortune dealing with land rights as an attorney for the railroad and the mining industry. Now, Morgan traveled to England, where he met with evolutionary theorists Charles Darwin and Sir John Lubbock. Now, returning from England, he wrote his most notable book, Ancient Society, where he came up with what he called the stages of human evolution, that man evolved from savagery to barbarism to civilization. Seeing the Indians as savages, seeing fundamental religionists as barbaric, on this course towards a civilized state. The other thing that Morgan learned in his visit to England was how the sciences were being used as a very powerful tool for social reform. With both Morgan and John Wesley Powell would take a hard look at this in advancing the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Now, they would not only see the American Indians as not evolved to the state of a full human, and thus you really don't have to give them rights under constitutional law. You can just gather them up and place them on reservations. But they came to understand how evolutionary thought could be used to change societal norms. Lewis Henry Morgan, as the American father of anthropology, and John Wesley Powell became good friends and worked together in advancing the sciences here in America and advancing these evolutionary ideas. Now, Powell's conviction, and this is a quote, that every variant could be placed somewhere on this evolutionary stairway gave direction and systems to Powell's work in ethnology. Emerging from this evolutionary stairway would be the enthronement of Darwinism, creating a new social vision for society, as they would view the origin of man and the origin of society through this lens of evolutionary thought, changing how society would come to view and value the American Indian, the ancient mound building cultures, but also how we view and value children, marriage, faith, and family in society today, along with other societal norms. It was these early evolutionary scientific theories that really paved the way for the leading proponents of manifest destiny, providing a rationale for American Indian policy, giving a blueprint for how to deal with the American Indians. Well, in upstate New York, I visited an old and rare bookstore. I took a drive up Bristol Mountain and found in this bookstore, I found a book authored by Frederick Engels, a man who co authored with Karl Marx the Communist Manifesto. In this 1893 book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, upon opening the front cover, I read these words: in light of the researches of Lewis Henry Morgan. I mean, here was Frederick Engels giving credit to Morgan for many insights that he shared in his book and that they used in the drafting of the Communist Manifesto, as both Frederick Engels and Karl Marx gave credit to Morgan's insight on the stages of human evolution, which manifesto today really inspired the signing of a 110-page manifesto even today, the Biden-Saunders Manifesto, which is really a blueprint of what their end game is and goal, where they want to take the country. And so it's an interesting read. Now, Engels, in his book, would insist that the family was a human creation, a vigorous institution that must be done away with. The family unit, which involves a mother and father in the home, which is really, as we would view in society, is foundational for the country's continued growth and economic prosperity. But the battle of the family is still being waged today. He would go on to say of Morgan that he reconstructed the form of the family and thereby opened up a new path of investigations and a more far-reaching retrospect into the prehistory of mankind. That is from his biographer in the book, A River Running West, The Life of John Wesley Powell. Now, this is really, as you might view, a real attack on the most fundamental unit of society, the natural family, and the outcomes that come from the family is absolutely vital. Now, in the studying their aim, it really helps to inspire us. We actually produced 3 documentaries looking at demographics and what was happening to the disintegration of the natural family worldwide and the effects that that would have on economies globally. Those documentaries were Demographic Winter, the decline of the human family. That was actually published by the Institute of European Studies. And they've actually published that documentary in over 60 different languages. As Demographic Winter, the decline of the human family, and then we produced Demographic Bomb, Demography is Destiny, the new economic reality, Demographic Winter, and the latest documentary is Outcomes, the Family and Faith Factors. In these documentaries, it looks at what is happening with the disintegration of the family and what has taken place with social engineering that has really affected how we view and value children, marriage, faith and family in society today. Now, Lawrence Crowder authored and published the historical transcripts of Karl Marx ethnological notebooks, giving new insight into Karl Marx's thoughts, which in published form became 250 pages of notes in which Marx credited the writings and inspiring them to dig into the writings of Lewis Henry Morgan on these evolutionary ideas. Now, both Engels and Marx would utilize this to launch the communist movement worldwide. Now, John Wesley Powell was also inspired by the writings of Lewis Henry Morgan on these evolutionary ideas, and he advanced them in the sciences to the academic communities here in America. So, is the same agenda that was being advanced there in the 1800s still being advanced today? These social reforming ideas that which led to the creation of civil unrest and the ideas to create a cancel culture movement. Did that happen in the 1800s? Yes. Is it happening today? Yes, it is. All in an effort to amass power, to restrict agency, to control society through the use of mandates, as really needed to advance totalitarian government and a socialist state. So did John Wesley Powell have a knowledge of these ancient mounds and these works as the director of the ethnology department of the Smithsonian? And if so, how was it handled? Well, he hired Cyrus Thomas, who published a map that they first went out there and identified all these mound building sites, these giant earthworks, fortifications that gave evidence of these mound building cultures. Now, Cyrus Thomas would be referred to as the final and last word as to anything relating to the mound building cultures in the late 1800s. And what we can learn from this map that we have out there, it shows a real concentration of mound sites up and down the major waterways of America's heartland. Now, John Wesley Powell, as director over the ethnology department of the Smithsonian, wrote what was entitled the Powell Doctrine on limitations of the use of some anthropologic data. The Powell Doctrine states, with regard to the mounds so widely scattered between two oceans, which he acknowledges, it may also be said that the mound builders or building tribes were known in the early history of the discovery of this continent, and that the vestiges of art discovered do not excel in any respect the art of the Indians known in history. There is therefore no reason for us to search for any extraliminal origin through the lost tribes from the art discovered in the mounds of North America. Hence, it will be seen that it is illegitimate to use any pictographic matter of a date anterior to the discovery of the continent by Columbus for historical purposes.
We'll stop it right there for today, folks. And did you catch that? This is really interesting. Anything today that we find as evidence for advanced cultures in North America before the time of Columbus is deemed by the scientific establishment as fringe archaeology. They had to even use a derogatory word to keep people from taking it seriously, the same way the establishment has with the term conspiracy theory. Before I understood just how wrong much of science is today through the scientific establishment, I actually loved to listen to archaeological types of podcasts. One that I listened to a lot was called Earth's Ancients. They talked a lot about pre-Columbian evidence and the Hopewell, actually, and I couldn't be more opposed to their views and conclusions. They think that many cultures in North America and around the world are much older than the scientific establishment says. Obviously, the scriptures say it is much younger. But one thing we can come together and be on the same page about is that the Smithsonian is involved in covering up that early evidence. I remember listening one time, and someone on the show said that they believed that there was a religious element trying to make the Earth look younger, and that's why the Smithsonian was doing it. I have come to the opposite conclusion, that it is an anti-religious element. But when you have two parties with diametrically opposing views agreeing on that one aspect, that the evidence was actually covered up and later ignored, it tends to give more credence to it being true, in my opinion. That's it for this week, folks. We'll get back with the rest of Steve Smoot's interview next week. Remember, you can send your questions, comments, and hate mail to mormontraditionalist@gmail.com. Follow me on Instagram @mormontraditionalist for more content. And until next time, remember, never back down from the truth.